All right, welcome back, your We're going to continue on our factorizing. Now, so far, most of the things we've looked at factorizing, we had 2 terms, maybe 3 terms. Now we're going to look at examples where there's 4 terms. So on something like this, we're going to use a technique which is called grouping. So what we can do is if we have 4 terms, again, we're only going to ever use this if we have 4 terms. If we're going to use this, we're going to try to group the terms together. So for example, I might look at those 2 terms and those 2 terms. And what I'm going to do is I'll start with the first 2 terms, xy plus 6x. Look for a common factor. Yes, they both have an x. So I can factor that out as x, and I'm left with y plus 6. Now I'll look at the next group of 2, yz plus 6z. Do they have a common factor? Yes, they both have a z. So I'm going to factor out the z, and what am I left with? Y plus 6. So we're not done yet because that's not factorized. It's not just 2 things multiplied together. I still have that plus sign between them. But now this should look familiar to the previous video we just did. I have x times y plus 6, or x times smiley face plus z times smiley face. So they both have a smiley face factor, or in this case, it's a y plus 6 I can bring out. If I bring out this y plus 6, I'm left with an x. And if I bring out this y plus 6, I'm left with a z. And we have it factorized. So again, the key is if you see a 4-term expression that you need to factorize, think about, the first thought should be, can I do it by grouping? Group together pairs, and you're really going to end up factorizing twice on this. Okay, there's one for you. I want you to pause the video, and I want you to factorize this using grouping, and then start the video when you're done. Okay, so we're going to do grouping, so we need to group them. I've got 4 terms, so I can group those 2 terms together and those 2 terms together. If I look at the first pair, x squared minus 5x, they both have a factor of x, leaving me with x minus 5. And if I look at the other pair, they both have a factor of y. And if I do that, I have x minus 5 in the brackets. So now again, now this looks like our previous video. We have something times a bracket plus, or minus it could be, y something else times a bracket, and the bracket is the same. So I can factor out the x minus 5. If I factor out this x minus 5, I'm left with an x. And if I factor out this x minus 5, I'm left with a y. And that is now factorized because it's 2 things multiplied together. It's a bracket times a bracket, so it is now factorized. This is, again, is factorizing by grouping. Okay, in your book, I want you to pause the video, factorize these using grouping in your book, and then we'll be back to check how we did. Okay, the first term, we're going to group those, and we're going to group those first. So if I do that and look for a common factor, I'm going to have b times a plus c, and over here I have a 3 times a plus c. Now they both have an a plus c, and I'm left with b plus 3. If I look at this next example, I'm going to group those, and I'm going to group those. So 6c plus 2d, they both have a factor of 2, leaving me with 3c plus d. And if I look at this other one, what do they have in common? They both have a b, leaving me with 3c plus d. The key that you're doing this right is both of your brackets should be the same. If you end up doing this and your brackets aren't the same, then either you've made a mistake or it's not possible to do this by grouping. So now I notice my bracket's the same, so I can factor out my bracket, my 3c plus d, and I'm left with this 2 times this plus b, and we have it factorized. The next example, I'm going to group those 2 terms, and I'm going to group those 2 terms. So if I do these, I have an x to bring out, leaving me with x minus y, and if I look at my other bracket, I have an 8 I can bring out, leaving me with x minus y. I'm feeling good because my brackets are the same, so I can bring my bracket out in front, x minus y, and that leaves me with x plus 8, and I have it factorized. Last example here, I can factorize or group those 2 together and group those 2 together. So if I do the first one, they both have an x, so I can factor out the x, leaving me with x minus y. And if we look at the other one, there is nothing to factor out, but I'm left with x minus y, which is the same thing as my bracket. So I'm just going to write it like that. And remember, there is a 1 in front of that bracket. So I have a common factor of x minus y, and I'm left with x plus 1. And now we're factorized. So once again, to summarize, if we have 4 terms and we need to factorize it, we should think about, are we going to be able to do it by grouping? Okay, let's look at a little harder example that still uses grouping. So if I look at this, all right, I've got 4 terms, and I'm going to try to group those together. So the first one, they both have an x, and leaving me with x minus y. Now, if I look at the next one, it looks like they have a common factor of 8. So if I bring an 8 out in front, I would be left with a minus x plus y. Okay, we can see that works because if I expand the bracket, 8 times minus x is minus 8x, and 8 times y is positive 8y. But we have a problem here. Our brackets are not the same. So that means we have a problem. So rather than bringing 8 out, we could bring something else. We could try bringing a negative 8 out. So let's bring a negative 8 out. And negative 8 times what is minus 8x is a positive x. And negative 8 times what is a positive 8y is a minus y. Now our brackets are the same. So now we can continue. They both have an x minus y. And I'm left with an x here and a minus 8 there. So I have it factorized. So again, if we start to factorize by grouping and realize our brackets aren't the same, the key is usually our brackets is just off by a negative sign. So maybe instead of bringing out the positive number, try bringing out the negative number. Okay, I want you to pause the video and I want you to factorize this one by grouping. Again, be careful with your negative signs on this. Make sure your first brackets end up to be the same. Okay, here we go. I've got 4 terms. I'm going to think about doing it by grouping. So the first one, AC plus AD, they both have a factor of A, leaving me with C plus C. This next one, they both have a factor of B or minus B. B and minus B are both factors. So let's think about, if I think ahead, if I bring the minus B out, I'm going to have C plus D inside the brackets. If I brought a positive B out, my bracket would not be the same as my other bracket. We can make sure that we've done this right, because if I tried expanding, minus B times C is minus BC, and minus B times D is minus BD. So we have factorized it correctly, and our brackets are the same. So they have a common factor of C plus D. I can bring out, and I'm left with my A, and I'm left with my minus B. So we factorize it. So again, you can always check by expanding the brackets. Try expanding those brackets and see if you end up with what you started with. Okay, last set we're going to practice by grouping here. Pause the video. Factorize these by grouping. Again, be careful with your negatives. Okay, we're going to factorize these by grouping. I'm going to group them like that. So if I do that, these have a common factor of B with B plus C. And over here, again, I want to have a plus B plus C in my bracket. So I'm going to factor out a minus 3, which will leave me with B plus C. Now they both have a B plus C. And after I factor that out, I'm left with this B and this minus 3. So B minus 3. Again, if you expand the brackets, you should end up with what you started with. Okay, again, I'm going to group these. And these both have an A in common. And if I look at the other pair, right, they both have a D in common. Now I want to be careful. Do I want to bring out a D or a negative D? And it turns out, I think it is, we want to have a negative D, because then that's going to be a B, and that's going to be a minus C. So now they both have a common factor of B minus C, and I'm left with A minus D. It's just a matter of analyzing your signs. If I group those together, I have a factor of X. And I want to bring a 2 out. So this time I want to bring a positive 2 out. And notice my bracket's the same, so now I can factor out my X minus Y times X plus 2. Now, if we look at the last one here again, I'm going to group, so I'm going to group those two together, and I'm going to group those two together. So this has a factor of x times x minus 5, and the next pair has a common factor of y, but it could be a y or a minus y. So since there's a plus here and I want it to be a minus, I want to factor out a minus y, which would leave me with x minus 5. So I can factor out x minus 5, and that's going to leave me with this x and this minus y. Again, if I expand those brackets at the end that I factorize, I should end up with what I've started. So this is factorizing by grouping. The other point that I will make is sometimes when you group them side by side like this, it's not going to work. Sometimes you might need to rearrange the order of the terms so that you get common factors. Sometimes the two next to each other are not going to have a common factor, and maybe you need to rearrange them.